June 4th, 1940. Fourth rain hammered against the windows of Southwick House like machine gun fire, each droplet a harbinger of uncertainty. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight David Eisenhower stood motionless before the weather charts, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as meteorologist. Group Captain James Martin Stagg delivered news that could alter the course of human history. The invasion, meticulously planned for June 5th, hung in the balance as Mother Nature threatened to become Hitler's most powerful ally. "The weather front is unprecedented, General," Stagg reported, his voice cutting through the tension thick. "Air, winds reaching 35 knots, clouds ceiling at 500 feet, and seas running 4 to 6 feet. The conditions are simply impossible for an amphibious assault of this magnitude." Around the map-covered table sat the architects of Operation Overlord. British General Bernard Law Montgomery, his sharp eyes reflecting decades of desert warfare. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, whose naval expertise had orchestrated the evacuation at Dunkirk. And Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lamellery, whose air armadas would need clear skies to succeed. Each man understood that postponement meant more than tactical delay, meant extending the war, prolonging the Holocaust, potentially losing the narrow window of opportunity they had fought so desperately to create. The weight of 150,000 Allied soldiers pressed upon Eisenhower's shoulders. Across the English Channel, these men huddled in landing craft, seasick and terrified. Knowing that dawn would either bring liberation or death, American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had already blackened their faces and checked their equipment for the 100th time. British commandos sharpened their knives while Canadian infantry wrote final letters home. The greatest military machine in human history waited for one man's decision. "What are the alternatives?" Montgomery asked, his clipped accent betraying none of the anxiety that gnawed at every man present. They all knew the answer. June had been chosen for its optimal tidal conditions and moonlight for the airborne operations. Delay meant waiting until June 19th, or worse. Until July, when German reinforcements would be stronger, the Atlantic wall would be more impregnable, when the element of surprise would be lost forever. According to the comprehensive analysis published in Stephen Ambrose's authoritative work D-Day, June 6, 1944, the meteorological conditions on June 4th represented one of the most challenging weather patterns recorded in the English Channel during the spring of 1940-4. Eisenhower walked to the window, watching the storm rage across the Hampshire countryside. Somewhere beyond that tempest lay the beaches of Normandy, where German sentries peered through the darkness, unaware that the fate of civilization itself approached through the storm. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, confident that no sane commander would launch an invasion in such weather. It was this very insanity that might prove to be genius. The clock ticked toward the final decision point. Ships were all ready, moving toward their assembly areas, their holds packed with young men who had trained for months, even years, for this moment. Some carried photographs of sweethearts, others clutched rosaries or prayer books. All carried the hopes of the free world. As midnight approached June 5th, Eisenhower faced the loneliest decision in military history, knowing that whatever he chose would echo through eternity. June 5th, 1944, at 4:15 in the morning. Group Captain Stagg returned to the war room with news that would change everything. His latest meteorological analysis revealed a break in the weather pattern, a narrow window of opportunity that would open just after dawn on June 6th. The storm systems would part like the Red Sea, offering perhaps 36 hours of marginally acceptable conditions before the next weather front arrived. "Gentlemen," Stagg announced, his voice carrying the weight of destiny, "there appears to be a temporary improvement coming. The winds will drop to 15 knots, cloud ceiling will lift to 3,000 feet, and wave heights will diminish 2, 3 to 4 feet. It's not ideal, but it's workable." Eisenhower studied the faces around him. Montgomery's expression remained stoic, but his fingers drummed once against the tabula, telltale sign of his racing mind calculating probabilities. Admiral Ramsay leaned forward, his naval experience telling him that while the conditions were far from perfect, they were within the realm of possibility for his vast armada. Air Chief Marshal Lamelliere's concerns were visible. His bombers and fighters would still face challenging conditions. But the mission could proceed. The Supreme Commander closed his eyes for a moment, and in that silence the ghosts of history whispered. He thought of Abraham Lincoln during the darkest days of the American Civil War, of Washington crossing the Delaware, of Churchill standing alone against the Nazi tide in 1940. Leadership, true leadership, meant making impossible decisions with incomplete information and living with the consequences forever. The question is, Eisenhower said quietly, do we have enough of a window to get our forces ashore and established before the weather deteriorates again? He knew that once committed, there would be no turning back. Stretching across more than 50 miles of ocean could not simply reverse course if conditions worsened. At precisely 4:30, Eisenhower stood and faced his commanders. The room fell silent except for the steady ticking of the wall clock and the diminishing sound of rain against the windows. History held its breath. "Okay, we'll go," he said simply. Those 4 words unleashed the greatest military operation in human history. Within minutes, coded messages flashed across radio networks to commanders throughout southern England. Went out to the naval forces, Halsey into the air commanders, and Fairway to the ground units. Operation Overlord was a definitive go. The machine that had been poised for months now roared to life. At airfields across England, transport aircraft. Engines coughed and roared as paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions filed aboard. These men, many barely out of their teens, carried equipment weighing nearly 100 pounds each. Their faces, blackened with burnt cork and cocoa, showed a mixture of determination and terror. Major General Maxwell Taylor, commanding the 101st Airborne, walked among his men, offering quiet words of encouragement. He knew that many of these young Americans would not see another sunset, but he also knew that their sacrifice would unlock the door to Hitler's Fortress Europe. The paratroopers checked their weapons one final time. M1 Garand rifles, Thompson, submachine guns, fragmentation grenades, and the precious radio equipment that would coordinate the chaos of battle. Meanwhile, across the coastal ports of southern England, the greatest naval armada ever assembled was setting sail. Over 5,000 vessels of every description, battleships and destroyers, cruisers and corvettes, landing craft and support ships, began their journey into the English Channel. The statistics were staggering. Nearly 7,000 tons of bombs would be dropped. Over 5,000 tons of naval gunfire would precede the landings. And 150,000 men would assault Hitler's Atlantic Wall. As dawn broke on June 5th, Eisenhower composed a message that he hoped he would never have to send, a statement taking full responsibility if the invasion failed. With steady handwriting, he wrote the words that revealed the true burden of command: the troops. The Air and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. June 6th, 1944, 016 hours. The Normandy countryside slept under a blanket of darkness when the first C-47 transport aircraft crossed the French coast, their engines muffled by the sound of wind and distant thunder. Inside the lead aircraft, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment checked his watch. 16 minutes past midnight. In 14 minutes, he and his men would jump into history. The paratroopers sat in 2 rows, facing each other, their equipment so heavy that some could barely stand. Each man carried over 90 pounds of gear, rifles, ammunition, grenades, medical supplies, rations, and specialized equipment for their missions. Their faces, streaked with war paint, showed the strain of months of training condensed into this single moment of truth: stand up, hook up. The jumpmaster's commands echoed through the aircraft as red lights bathed the interior in an otherworldly glow. 20 young Americans struggled to their feet, their parachute static lines clipped. To the overhead cable, through the small windows, they could see tracer fire beginning to rise from German anti-aircraft. positions, deadly fireworks welcoming them to Hitler's Europe. The pilots of the transport aircraft faced a nightmare scenario. Low clouds and heavy anti-aircraft fires scattered the formations, forcing them to navigate by instinct and prayer. Many aircraft veered off course, their pilots desperately seeking safe passage through the maze of flak and fog. The careful drop zones, planned and rehearsed for months, became academic as survival took precedence over precision. At exactly 0030 hours, the green light flashed and Lieutenant Colonel Krauss stepped into the void. Behind him, 20 men followed, their parachutes blossoming like deadly flowers in the dark sky. As they descended, the sound of their aircraft faded, replaced by the crack of small arms fire and the distant rumble of naval gunfire from the Channel. The first Allied soldier to die on D-Day was Private First Class Robert Murphy of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. His parachute caught in the bell tower of Saint-Mère, Église, leaving him helplessly suspended as German soldiers below opened fire. His sacrifice would be commemorated, but in that moment, he was simply a 19-year-old from Ohio who would never see home again. Major General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, landed in a Norman apple orchard 3 miles from his intended drop zone. Alone and disoriented, he could hear the sound of small arms fire echoing across the countryside. Using his compass and years of military training, he began the lonely journey to rally his scattered forces, knowing that the success of the entire invasion might depend on the actions of small groups of paratroopers operating behind enemy lines. According to research documented in John Keegan's definitive military history, 6 Armies in Normandy, the airborne operations on DID represented one of the most ambitious and chaotic military undertakings of the war, though with over 13,000 American paratroopers dropped across a 50-mile front in less than 2 hours. The British 6th Airborne Division, led by Major General Richard Gale, faced equally challenging conditions as they descended east of the invasion beaches. Their mission was perhaps even more critical: seize and hold the vital bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River, preventing German armored reinforcements from reaching the landing beaches. Lieutenant Colonel John Howard's glider-borne force had already accomplished the impossible, capturing Pegasus Bridge in a lightning assault that would become legendary. As the pre-dawn hours unfolded, scattered groups of paratroopers began the deadly game of hide-and-seek with German defenders. Armed with cricket clickers for identification and passwords like Flash Thunder and Welcome Wagon, these young soldiers moved through hedgerows and farmyards, never knowing if the next shadow concealed friend or foe. The Germans, initially confused by conflicting reports, began to realize that this was no diversionary raid. Across Normandy, telephone lines buzzed with frantic messages to higher headquarters. But the masterpiece of Allied deception, Operation Fortitude, continued to work its magic.
Ouch.
German High Command remained convinced that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, keeping crucial reserves frozen in place. As dawn approached, the airborne forces had accomplished their primary mission, sowing confusion and preventing organized German response. Though scattered and under strength, they held key positions and would soon hear the sound that would lift their spirits, the thunder of Allied naval guns announcing that the seaborne invasion had begun. June 6, 1944, 5:30. Hours the horizon erupted in flame as HMS Warspite, veteran of Jutland and survivor of 2 world wars, opened fire with her 15-inch guns. The thunderous roar rolled across the English Channel like the voice of an angry god, announcing to every German defender from Cherbourg to Le Havre that the day of reckoning had arrived. Within moments, the entire Allied fleet joined the symphony of destruction, over 200 warships unleashing 5,000 tons of high-explosive ordnance onto Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Aboard the battleship USS Texas, Rear Admiral Carleton Bryant watched through his binoculars as shells the size of small automobiles screamed toward the Norman coast. Each 14-inch projectile carried enough explosive power to obliterate a city block, and the Texas was firing them as fast as her crew could load the massive guns. The ship's veteran gunners, many of whom had fought in the Pacific, worked with mechanical precision, knowing that American boys would soon be wading through the surf under German machine gun fire. The naval bombardment represented the culmination of centuries of military evolution. Ancient siege warfare had given way to precision naval gunfire, each shot calculated by teams of mathematicians and meteorologists. Fire control radars tracked targets invisible to the human eye, while forward observers and aircraft adjusted. Fall of shot with scientific accuracy. The medieval castle walls of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, no matter how thick, could not withstand the focused fury of modern naval artillery. On the German side, the bombardment created chaos and terror in equal measure. In Widerstandsnest 72, overlooking what the Allies called Omaha Beach, Oberkreiter Franz Göckel pressed himself against the concrete wall of his bunker as shells exploded around his position with earth-shaking violence. The 19-year-old machine gunner from Bavaria had been told that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, that no invasion force could survive the deadly crossfire of German defensive positions. Now, as concrete dust filled his lungs and the bunker shook with each near miss, he began to understand that this would be unlike anything he had experienced in 2 years of war. The Allied fleet stretched beyond the horizon, an armada so vast that German observers initially refused to believe their eyes. Over 5,000 vessels of every conceivable type crowded the waters off Normandy, fast destroyers weaving between lumbering landing ships, minesweepers clearing paths through German defenses, and hospital ships standing by to receive the wounded. The logistics alone represented a triumph of military planning, every ship precisely positioned, every unit coordinated to the minute, every contingency anticipated and prepared for. At exactly off 6:30 hours, the naval bombardment lifted and shifted to targets further inland. This was the signal that assault troops had been waiting for. Achor was 30 minutes away, and the first landing craft were already approaching the surf line. In the holds of transport ships, young soldiers made final preparations, checking weapons that had been checked a dozen times, adjusting equipment that was already perfectly positioned, and thinking thoughts that no training could prepare them. 4. The Channel crossing had been a nightmare for many of the assault troops. Seasickness had claimed more casualties than German fire, leaving soldiers weak and miserable before the battle even began. Private Harold Baumgarten of the 116th Infantry Regiment, destined for Omaha Beach, had spent the entire night vomiting over the side of his landing craft. Now, as the Normandy coast grew larger through the dawn mist, he tried to focus on his training and forget the churning in his stomach. According to detailed operational records analyzed in D-Day historian Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive research, the naval phase of Operation Neptune involved over 5,000 vessels and represented the largest amphibious operation in military history, requiring the coordination of British, American, Canadian, and Free French naval forces across a 50-mile front. The German coastal defenders, battered by hours of bombardment, now faced a sight that would haunt their nightmares forever, assuming they survived to have nightmares. Through the smoke and morning mist, they could see the dark shapes of landing craft approaching the beaches in waves. Hundreds of them, loaded with grim-faced soldiers who had crossed an ocean to be here. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's boasted fortress, was about to face its ultimate test as the first landing craft ground against the Norman sand. Soldiers who had trained for months in the safety of English countryside were about to discover the difference between preparation and reality. The textbook was closing. Examination was about to begin, and failure meant death. June 6, 1944. 6:30 hours. The ramp of landing craft. Vehicle. Personnel 1407 dropped into the cold waters of the English Channel, and Sergeant Ray Lambert of the 1st Infantry Division stepped into hell. The water reached his chest, and immediately the distinctive crack of German machine gun fire split the morning air. Around him, soldiers of the Big Red One, veterans of North Africa and Sicily, began falling before they could even reach the beach. "Move, move, get off the X." Lieutenant Robert Edlund shouted over the devastating crescendo of gunfire, but his words were lost in the chaos. Omaha Beach, designated by Allied planners as a relatively easy objective, had become a killing field. The pre-invasion bombardment, so impressive from the ships, had failed to neutralize the German defensive positions. Oberst Fritz Zegelmann's 352nd Infantry Division had survived the steel rain and now unleashed everything they had on the exposed. Americans struggling through the surf, the beach stretched for 6,000 yards, but to the men dying on it, it seemed infinite. German machine gunners in concrete bunkers raked the sand with interlocking fields of fire, their MG-42 machine guns capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. Every approach had been calculated, every killing zone prepared. American soldiers found themselves trapped between the tide and the wire, with nowhere to go but forward into the guns or backward into the sea. Private First Class Harold Baumgarten, still weak from seasickness, made it 10 yards up the beach before a German bullet shattered his left cheek and knocked out several teeth. Blood filled his mouth, but he kept crawling forward, driven by training and the survival instinct that separates soldiers from civilians. Around him, sand turned red with American blood as the 1st and 29th Infantry divisions paid the price for Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The German defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. In wider stands, NIST 76, Unteroffizier Heinrich Severloh crouched behind his MG-42 and fired burst after burst into the advancing Americans. The young German from Lower Saxony had trained for this moment for 3 years, and now he found himself in a position to change history. His machine gun grew so hot from continuous firing that he had to pour water over the barrel to prevent it from warping, but the Americans kept coming. This was the generation that had grown up during the Great Depression, men who understood hardship and sacrifice. They had crossed an ocean not for glory or conquest, but because they understood that some things were worth dying for. Staff Sergeant Walter Ehlers of the 18th Infantry Regiment, despite being wounded twice, continued to lead his squad forward, using hand grenades and rifle fire to silence German positions one by one. The tide was rising, and wounded men who couldn't move found themselves drowning in 18 inches of water. Medics worked frantically to drag casualties above the high water mark, but German snipers targeted anyone wearing the distinctive Red Cross. Corpsman John Bradley ignored the bullets whistling around him as he administered morphine and bandaged wounds, knowing that every second meant the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers. By 0800 hours, the situation on Omaha Beach had reached crisis point. General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army from the cruiser USS Augusta, seriously considered evacuating the beach and redirecting forces to other sectors. The casualties were staggering over 2,000 killed, wounded, and missing in the first 2 hours of fighting. The cream of American infantry divisions was being destroyed on a narrow strip of Norman sand. According to the comprehensive combat records documented in the official U.S. Army history cross-channel attack by Gordon Harrison, the fighting on Omaha Beach represented one of the closest calls in military history. The outcome balanced on a knife's edge for over 6 crucial hours. Then, slowly, individual acts of heroism began to turn the tide. Brigadier General Norman Cota, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, walked calmly along the beach under heavy fire, rallying his men with words that would echo through history. "Gentlemen, we are being killed on the beaches. Let us go inland and be killed." His calm courage inspired others to action. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment gathered scattered groups of soldiers and led them in a direct assault on the German positions. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach," he shouted. "The dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." These words galvanized American survivors into action. Slowly, impossibly, they began to move inland. As the morning wore on, American determination began to overcome German defensive fire. The invasion hung in the balance, decided not by grand strategy or superior equipment, but by the courage of individual soldiers who chose to stand up and fight when everything seemed lost. June 6th, 1944, 12 o'clock hours by noon, the character of the battle had fundamentally changed. What began as a German turkey shoot had evolved into a grinding infantry battle as American forces finally gained footholds on all 5 landing beaches. At Utah Beach, the 4th Infantry Division had not only secured their objectives, but were advancing inland with minimal casualties thanks to being landed nearly 2 miles south of their intended targetia. Navigational error that proved fortunate beyond measure. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., at 56, the oldest man to land with the assault troops, had made the decision that saved Utah Beach. When he realized his forces were in the wrong location, the son of President Theodore Roosevelt calmly surveyed the situation and declared, "We'll start the war from right here." His leadership and the relatively light German defenses in this sector allowed the 4th Infantry Division to secure their beachhead and begin linking up with the airborne forces inland. At Gold Beach, the British 50th Northumbrian Division had punched through German defenses and were advancing on the town of Br. Major Stanley Hollis of the Green Howards won the only Victoria Cross awarded on D-Day, single-handedly clearing 2 German pillboxes with grenades and submachine gun fire. The British forces, veterans of desert warfare in North Africa, brought professional competence to their assault that overwhelmed German resistance through sheer tactical skill. The Canadian 3rd Infantry Division at Juno Beach had faced some of the heaviest resistance outside of Omaha, but their aggressive assault tactics had carried them further inland than any other Allied unit. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and Regina Rifle Regiment, supported by Fort Garry horse tanks, had advanced nearly 6 miles by midday, the deepest penetration of any D-Day force. These prairie soldiers brought a particular ferocity to the fighting that surprised German defenders accustomed to more cautious British tactics. At Sword Beach, the British 3rd Infantry Division under Major General Tom Rennie had secured their beachhead but faced the day's most dangerous counterattack. The 21st Panzer Division, the only significant German armored reserve in Normandy, had finally been released by confused German commanders. Their attack nearly reached the sea, potentially splitting British forces and creating a catastrophic gap in the Allied beachhead. However, German counterattack revealed the fundamental weakness in Hitler's defensive strategy. The 21st Panzer Division, once commanded by Erwin Rommel himself in North Africa, was a shadow of its former strength. Their tanks were a mixture of obsolete French vehicles and captured equipment, manned by crews with limited training and facing an enemy that controlled both sea and sky. When RAF Typhoon fighter bombers screamed down to attack the German column, the counterattack dissolved in flame and smoke. Back at Omaha Beach, the situation had stabilized through sheer American determination and improvisation. Rangers had scaled the cliffs at Pont du Hoc under enemy fire to destroy German guns that, ironically, had been moved inland days before the invasion. The 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, accomplished their mission despite suffering 60% casualties in the process. The breakthrough at Omaha came not from grand tactics, but from small unit leadership. Staff Sergeant Philip Strechik of the 16th Infantry Regiment organized a mixed group of soldiers from different units and led them through a gap in the German wire. Once inland, these small groups began attacking German positions from behind, turning the defenders' advantages against them. The German strongpoints, designed to resist frontal assault, proved vulnerable to attack from unexpected directions. As described in the meticulously researched account by historian Max Hastings in Overlord, D-Day, and the Battle for Normandy, the success of the landings ultimately depended less on overwhelming force than on the initiative and courage of junior leaders, who adapted to battlefield conditions that no amount of planning could have anticipated. By afternoon, the German situation had become desperate. General Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps responsible for defending the invasion area, had been killed by Allied aircraft while attempting to coordinate his scattered forces. Without effective leadership and facing attacks from sea, land, and air, German resistance began to crumble. Units that had fought magnificently in the morning were now retreating in disorder, their ammunition exhausted and their communications severed. The most critical moment came when German commanders finally realized the magnitude of the Allied assault. This was no feint or diversionary attack. The entire future of Nazi Germany was being decided on the beaches of Normandy. But by then, it was too late to prevent what Winston Churchill would later call the most complicated and difficult, the operation that has ever taken place. As the sun began to set on June 6, 156,000 Allied soldiers had landed in Nazi-occupied Europe and were there to stay. June 6, 1944, 18 o'clock hours, as the Norman sun began its descent toward the English Channel, casting long shadows across beaches littered with the debris of modern warfare. The magnitude of what had been accomplished became clear. The longest day in military history was drawing to a close. And Adolf Hitler's Atlantic Wall, that vaunted fortress that was supposed to protect Nazi Europe for 1,000 years, lay in ruins, along 50 miles of French coastline. The statistics told only part of the story. Allied casualties numbered approximately 10,000 killed, wounded, and missing, a devastating toll by any measure. Yet far below the pessimistic predictions of Allied planners who had feared losses of up to 20,000 men, German casualties were harder to calculate in the chaos of defeat, but entire defensive units had been wiped out or had surrendered en masse. More importantly, the psychological impact of the successful invasion would reverberate throughout Nazi Germany and occupied Europe. At his command post in Berchtesgaden, Adolf Hitler remained convinced that Normandy was still a diversionary attack, that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. This fatal delusion, carefully cultivated by Allied deception operations, meant that powerful German reserves remained frozen in place while the Normandy beachhead expanded and consolidated. The 15th Army, perhaps Germany's strongest force, in Western Europe, waited uselessly for an invasion that would never come. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, turning hastily from Germany after hearing news of the landings, surveyed the disaster with professional detachment. The Desert Fox, who had once seemed invincible in North Africa, now faced an enemy that controlled the seas, dominated the skies, and possessed inexhaustible resources. Standing among the ruins of German coastal defenses, he quietly told his aide, "The war's lost." It was a remarkable admission from the man many considered Germany's finest general. The human cost of victory was written in blood across Norman sand and in the faces of survivors. Private Harold Baumgarten, wounded early in the assault on Omaha Beach, would carry physical and emotional scars for the rest of his life. But he and thousands like him had accomplished something that would echo through history. They had opened the second front that would crush Nazi Germany between Allied forces advancing from east and west, in field hospitals hastily established behind the beaches. Doctors and nurses worked frantically to save wounded soldiers who had survived the greatest gamble in military history. These medical personnel, many of them volunteers who could have remained safely in England or America, represented the humanitarian face of military necessity. Their dedication ensured that many young men who might have died would live to see victory and return home to families who were just learning of the invasion through radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines. The British Broadcasting Corporation's announcement at midday had electrified the world. D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European fortress. In London, crowds gathered in the streets despite wartime blackout regulations. In New York, church bells rang and ticker tape fell like snow. In Moscow, Stalin finally understood that his Western allies had delivered on their promise of a second front. But perhaps the most significant impact was felt in the occupied territories of Nazi Europe. Resistance fighters in France, who had waited for long years for this moment, emerged from hiding to harass German communications and prevent reinforcements from reaching Normandy. In Poland, Jewish partisans in the Warsaw Ghetto used their last bullets with renewed hope. Throughout Hitler's enslaved empire, the message was clear. Liberation was no longer a dream, but an approaching reality. The airborne forces scattered and disorganized in the pre-dawn darkness, but accomplished their mission through sheer determination and small unit leadership. Major General Matthew Ridgway's 82nd Airborne Division controlled key terrain behind Utah Beach, while Major General Maxwell Taylor's 101st Airborne held vital crossroads that prevented German counterattacks. These citizen soldiers, many of whom had been college students or factory workers just 3 years earlier, it's proven that democratic nations could produce warriors equal to any in history, as documented in the comprehensive analysis by military historian John Keegan. D-Day represented not just tactical success, but strategic revolution. The moment when industrial democracy proved its superiority over totalitarian militarism through superior planning, logistics, and the courage of free men fighting for principles they understood and believed in. As darkness fell on June 6, 1944, beachheads that had been measured in yards at dawn now extended several miles inland. The greatest amphibious invasion in history had succeeded, and Nazi Germany's doom was sealed. The road to Berlin would be long and costly, but it now ran through the apple orchards and hedgerows of Normandy, paved with the courage of young men who answered history's call and changed the world forever. The invasion that began in darkness and storm had ended in triumph, proving that when free nations unite in common cause, no fortress, however strong, no enemy, however determined, can prevail against the power of human freedom.